this is Dena Ackerman, and if you're like me, you dream of creating loose, expressive, effortless watercolor paintings. Lucky for us, we have Tom Shepard, the popular and beloved UK-based artist, to show us how he uses values to create those loose, dynamic, color-saturated watercolor paintings we all love. This is a two-part demonstration, so make sure you don't miss part one.
Before I moved to Daniel Smith, for most of my painting, I did also use Holbein a lot, and I think Holbein paint's a really great paint. I mean, there's so many great paints out there, and to be honest, a lot of them are similar.
Yeah.
You know, they just with subtle differences. I like Daniel Smith because they don't really. And it's a two-edged thing. Like Winsor and Newton, for example, they almost like standardize all of their paints so that they behave in a very familiar and very kind of consistent way. Mm-hmm. Daniel Smith don't really do that. They don't really tinker with their pigment, and therefore some of the pigments initially can be quite hard to get used to, because you might be used to maybe a brand that has made the paints behave more consistently. So there is an adjustment period to, say, someone like Daniel Smith with some colours. Holbein, I think, is a really great combination of very consistent colours, great transparency, packed full of lovely juicy pigment, and I still have plenty of Holbein colours knocking around as well.
Okay.
So yeah, let's look at this. So I mean, this, you know, when we're painting a still life and with strong light and shadow, I always feel like it's very easy to see and understand this kind of way of analysing a subject, light family, shadow family. And the reason I chose this is because there's some areas that are like the still life, i.e. the buildings. You've got a very clear light family. You've got a very clear shadow family. That's going to give the structure. It's going to create the form of the buildings. And also, and it's not immediately obvious, but particularly on a screen, within a screen, but there's very clear kind of gentle shadow, which has a slight softness to it. And then within the gentle shadow, there's very clear kind of darker areas that are like deeper shadow. So that's kind of that principle applied to the building by itself. And there's lots of scope to play around with that. We play around with the colours and stuff like that a little bit. But then there's still the same thing in the foliage. The only difference is, you know, for example, the light family or the light side of the trees here is significantly darker in tone than the lights hitting the building. And it's just something, it's not like we need to obsess about this in any great way. It's almost to show you that you can use this process to think about your subject in quite a logical way, which I feel makes things a lot easier. But there's also like plenty of scope to break away from it. And as we've seen, paint a little bit more freely. You might say intuitively and spontaneously in some cases, but you might also say in other cases, I say to people, don't be afraid to forget the process and just paint what you see. Like if you see a sort of lightish green that becomes darker, you don't have to obsess about, oh, is this definitely the gentle shadow or the deep shadow? Sometimes you can just paint things as you see them, or as you want to see them, as we were saying. So my point of choosing this one is that it's going to be, I feel, an interesting combination of using the more structured process in the more structured areas like the buildings, and then combining that with a little bit more of a kind of slightly more carefree attitude of let's just get a tree down and paint it wet into wet and see what happens in other areas. So basically trying to find that balance between those kind of two ways of thinking about a subject. So I really like this subject. For me, this building is the focal point, and I've kind of, as in the photo, I've just moved things around a little bit to make it a bit more pleasing to the eye, but not a huge amount. But I like the focal point and the way it's set off to one side, kind of an unequal distance from all the parts. It probably is roughly on the old thirds if you dissect it, which is, you know, something around there is nice. But I tend to think more along the lines of focal point and unequal distance from the sides in a place that feels good to you. Again, we kind of avoid all of this rigid, must be right, must be exactly this, and be a little bit more, how does it feel to you with the composition? And this composition feels good to me. I just kind of shoved that over a bit, so it's a bit more kind of uneven and less kind of down the middle, and that to me feels like a nice natural composition. And so the focal point's going to have a little bit more detail on it, be a little bit more high in contrast and that sort of thing. And then we will still have light falling on the buildings, but ultimately this is kind of the support act to the main event. So whilst I do want information down here, it's quite an interesting one, because actually we're kind of saying, well, look over the top of the foreground to the main event, which is actually kind of in the midground, but we still want to kind of pull attention to it. And then we can play around with lots of lovely kind of wet into wet and all of that sort of thing. So I'm still going to use a two-part process. We're going to lay in lots of lovely kind of light colors to start with, let everything flow together, leave plenty of whites to the page, let that dry, and then we're going to use a fairly sort of systematic process of just going around the painting and blocking it in, but within individual areas, trying to be a little bit more free with the paint. So again, we're finding this kind of balance between kind of more logical processes and ways of looking at things and breaking the subject down, mixed with like the sort of slightly more creative, spontaneous side of things, and where we're letting the medium do its thing. So all the time I'm trying to find that sort of balance point between those two things. I think they're both kind of needed. So let's just go for it. I'm going to use exactly the same colors just for simplicity and just to show you that we can kind of push it in a different direction, but you could very happily throw in like a cobalt blue here. Some people feel more comfortable using like a cerulean blue to mix their greens because it gives a little bit more opacity, which can be quite nice. Actually, the cobalt teal blue that I use, although it's kind of billed as being a semi-transparent color, for me it feels like it has a little bit of opacity to it, which I like when I put it in the greens, and it allows me to block them in with a bit more solidness, which can be quite nice. But really we've got like a cool and a warm blue, a neutral, slightly cool, vibrant, transparent red, the quinacridone pink, Indian yellow, which is nice and versatile, especially with the turquoise, and that's kind of giving us everything that we want. And again, if your page dries very quickly, you might want to wet the whole thing first. I've got a spray bottle on hand if I need it, but what I'm doing is getting lots of water down as quick as possible, and I'm working on a slight tilt. So what I'm kind of aiming for is a little bead of water to collect at the bottom of the wash, ideally. That gives us a little bit more freedom with everything. And we're just going to kind of drag it down here. I don't need to reserve any whites of the page to start with. However, as we get close to the top of the building here, I'm going to be a little bit more precise with my marks, and I kind of do a mark that's precise and then work it into what's there. We can block in a bit of colour on the buildings later. And now as I move down here, I'm going to introduce just a touch of Indian yellow, and we're going to just kind of pop it in there. I'm not really painting trees. I'm just sort of blocking in a bit of colour. As long as that stays light. Oh, yes. Was that a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. Is this are you working from a photo that you took? Is it somewhere that you...
Oh, no, I didn't. This one I actually just found online. So I use a website called iStock a lot, because it's got so many great photos on there. I exhausted my own photos.
Oh, I'm just jealous of anybody who lives over in your area of the world, because it always looks beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I don't actually know where this is, to be honest. It will have been on the photo, and I do check. But yeah, I mean, where I live here in Pembrokeshire, we do have amazing, particularly beach scenes, escapes, and we've also got some amazing woodland. Lots of old buildings, lots of castles. So this year, and I did say this last year, I do hope to get out and paint and photograph.
That's what we're missing here in Israel. We're missing castles.
Yeah.
We have some.
It's one thing we have a lot in Wales is castles. Have you got old buildings and that sort of thing?
We've got some old buildings and some crumbling ruins, but
great.
No castles.
Yeah, it's easy, isn't it, to because I grew up obviously in the UK, and I grew up in Stratford-on-Avon, which is like Shakespeare's birthplace, and I even went to school in the same school as Shakespeare, and it's like hundreds of years old, the classrooms we were in. and some of the oldest pubs in the UK, some of the oldest buildings. But as a kid, you just take it for granted because it's just what's around you, and that as a teenager, amazing. I couldn't have cared less though. But now as an adult, I start to realise it was pretty special, really. Having all of that, and my family, even though we live in Wales now, which is more kind of beach kind of territory, my family still lives in the Midlands, so still plenty of scope for going back. And I have painted in Stratford-on-Avon a few times, and there's such great subject matter there. It's awesome. But yeah, it's nice to have that around, isn't it?
It's so nice. Yes.
Okay, so you can see I'm letting all of the colors just flow together as much as possible, because again, I know that the structure of the painting will be born out of the light and shadow. So we're just painting the light family here. Now, the lights, the light hitting the grass here is significantly lighter than the light hitting the trees, but not as light as the light hitting the building. So whilst I'm not being like super exact about it, I am having these little sort of thoughts and considerations, at least as I'm painting. And then I don't want the buildings to be like a bright white. For me, that's a bit too intense. So what I'm doing is trying to mix like some very, very light kind of soft greys. And coloured greys are such a beautiful thing in watercolour. So when I'm looking at the buildings, the stonework, I'm seeing like a slight warmness to it. So I'm mixing blue, French ultramarine, my pink and my yellow. And it's got a slight bias towards the red and the yellow. So it's giving that grey a really lovely kind of gentle warmth to it. And that gentle warmth is really, really, really lovely. When I'm looking at the roofs, and I'm almost going to exaggerate this because I'm painting partly what I see, but also what I want to see. It comes back to that all the time. When I'm looking at the roofs of the buildings, to me, they have a slight coolness to them. So I'm going to use exactly the same grey mix, but I'm just going to push it towards having a little bit more blue. And it's just to create some variety in our greys. So for me, this is a really useful way of thinking about colour. Instead of thinking about colour as an exact science, and I must mix the colour to be exactly this, and using absolutes and exact words all the time, I'm always using warm and cool. So if this is a green, does it feel a little bit more yellowy and a little bit warmer, or does it feel a little bit more cool and a little more bluey? If it's a grey, does it feel a bit cooler or a bit warmer? So we're kind of stepping away again from having to get everything exactly right, and thinking in a slightly more kind of freeform way. And I just find that can really help a lot of people break away from this kind of feeling like we need to get everything right all the time. And when we break away from that, I feel like we can paint a little bit more loosely and a little bit more freely. So again, it's finding different ways of thinking about things that kind of work for our brains. You know what I mean? So for me, that's the block-in. So lots of lovely whites of the page, and they're not necessarily directly related to anything, but I do like to keep plenty of them about because it just keeps a painting a bit more lively. I've definitely purposely kept some around the focal point, but there's a few others knocking around. And then nothing too dark. Everything is fairly light. The buildings at this stage are a little bit lighter than the grass, and then we'll do the darker colours of the trees in a sec. So I'm going to let all of that dry very quickly. So if anyone's got any questions after I've done the hair drying, please do ask. Okay, cool. Give me a second. If anyone has any questions, please do ask.
Yeah, one question in the chat. What is the blue that you're using
Right.
now?
So the only blue I've used so far in this painting is French ultramarine.
Okay.
So yeah, that's or just normal ultramarine. I think French ultramarine is ever so slightly softer, tiny bit warmer, but ultramarine would be doing exactly the same thing. And obviously ultramarine, because it's quite a warm blue, it's never going to give you really vibrant greens. But in this early stage of the painting, most of the greens have got a lot of yellow in, so the yellow is kind of dominating the mixture, and that's why it's giving us quite bright. Although they're quite subdued greens, they're not like really punchy greens. But then that's the nature of the greens here. And then when I do want some stronger greens, that's when the cobalt teal blue kind of bumps up the Indian yellow a little bit more.
I have another question. So you said you're painting on a slight slant right now.
Yeah.
Was your previous painting also painted on a slant?
It was, yeah. So it's actually quite a bit flatter than I would paint in the studio, but that's more because we're doing a demo. It's a bit easier to just see it flatter. So I'm working on probably only like 10-15 degree slope. Generally, when I'm working in the studio, I tend to work more on I'm just putting figures on it, but it feels more like kind of 35, 40-ish degrees. So because it kind of gets the paint flowing a little bit more. And you kind of down the page.
Yeah, you leave it like that for the whole process, or is it just for the?
Yeah, I do kind of adjust it as I'm going. Like if it's running too much, then kind of knock it back a bit. And then if I want it to, with the demos, I'm not quite as. I'm a little bit more rigid than I would. Yeah, like in the studio, I might pick up the board and moving the paint around and playing around with it a bit more. But that for me, that doesn't really translate to on camera so well. So yeah, I tend to keep it a little bit simpler. But that said, sometimes it's nice, the simplicity of just having it fairly flat and just getting on with the painting. Setting yourself limitations sometimes is actually quite beneficial. So yeah, it's no bad thing. Okay, so I love the kind of hazy blue in the background. It's not actually the sky. We've got kind of very, very distant mountains back there. I don't think I'm going to try and really show that there's much going on back there. I think I'm more interested in bringing this area to life. And then we can always make a decision at the end if we feel it needs a little bit more at the back. So that's my idea there. So I'm going to drop down to a slightly smaller brush. You can see it's almost the perfect size for kind of blocking in these trees. So probably the most important area of the whole painting is the way that this beautiful light shape on the building here is trapped by that little tree behind and the wall here in shadow. So if you can kind of make sense of this, because it's the focal area, would be quite surprised at how abstract you can be with the rest of the painting. And quite nicely now, the focal point is kind of, I quite like working from top to bottom, back to front. Not always, but it kind of suits this one. And so we're gonna kind of trap the focal point fairly quickly. So I'm going to exaggerate the coolness of the greens to create a sense of depth. Like in the photo, and photos often tend to do this, the greens are all very similar. But from a painter's point of view, I'm going to make my blues my greens in the background much more blue. So I'm going to put more cobalt in them and even a bit of Prussian in there because it's quite a cool blue. It's quite a dominating blue. So I need to be, I'm kind of playing around a little bit here with my colors, adding very tiny amounts of red to kind of subdue the green and give it a bit of a coolness, and picking up some of that and just getting in here. So yeah, that's quite a cool color. It's a bit too strong though. I feel like it's going to compete for attention. So I'm going to add red to the green, obviously being complementary. It subdues the green. And for this early on in the painting, I'm being quite controlled here with the way that I'm doing this area, but it's because I really want to make sure I get the shape accurate. And again, I'm not going to use the word right. I'm going to use the word accurate because it needs a certain level of accuracy in this particular case. I've forgotten to mix the red in very well, so we're getting blobs of red in there, but it doesn't really matter. The only thing that I don't really like about that background tree there is that it's got a bit of a hard edge. Now, if I painted it wet into wet while the background was still wet, we'd get softer edges. But the other trick is, of course, we can just give it a blast with the with the spray bottle. And what that does is it gives us a little puddle of water for our fresh new wash to kind of bleed up into, and it's going to give us that more out of focus feeling to that background tree. So that can be a nice way to work. And then I'm going to be a little bit more freeform here. As we come forward, I'm going to come into a much creamier paint consistency, but I still want quite a muted green. So I'm going to put a little bit of red in it. There's more blue in there to make it darker, but there's also a stronger paint consistency. Nope, darker still. And yeah, that's nice. Can ramp up the intensity of colour later. There we go. So using the brush a little bit drier, and I'm just going to kind of knock this in here. Try and keep a few whites of the page just to keep it lively. I'm purposely kind of taking off the excess water because I almost want the brush to be a little bit scruffy for these trees. I don't want loads of visual noise, but I do want, you know, a kind of liveliness to it. I don't want like a really smooth edge to everything. And then I'm going to kind of bring that into there. It's a dead simple. Leave lots of whites of the page. You can see now already we're getting this feeling of the building is going to be a bit more precise. The trees are going to be a little bit more freeform. And that's how we're going to approach this whole painting. So we could even, you know what, let's take it off the top and really break the composition off the top of the page. I think that's going to benefit. Now, if we feel like it's lacking a dark, we can always give it, if there's plenty of water on there, we don't need to, but I'm going to give it a little spray of water. And then I've brought a little bit more of the blue into it. That's going to give it a darkness. And we can start to play around a little bit with dropping in some darker tones. Now, if those darker tones are not spreading out as much as you'd like, this is again where having more water in our mixture and on our page tends to benefit us, because that's going to give us time and freedom to kind of play around. And then again, a spray bottle. So I really have only started using a spray bottle very recently in my painting. I don't know why. It's not like I've purposely avoided it, but I've just not bothered for a long time. And now that I'm using one, I'm like, oh God, they're fantastic. You can soften edges over here. You can keep areas alive for a lot longer. So, you know, the wetter the area is, the more alive it is, and the more we can continue to work into it. So I'm a total spray bottle convert, basically, and always having a little one on hand is so useful. So now I'm just going to bring up the paint consistency one last time to be a little bit thicker. I just want to increase the intensity of dark in a couple of areas. It's a very muted color back here. So as I said before, I love strong color, but in this one, I do want to get some strong color going on, but I'm just kind of trying to force myself to leave the background colors a little bit more muted, so that as I come forward, I can maybe be a little bit more bold with the color. And it won't kind of flatten it out. If I go muted, cool, and not too dark in the background, I can be a little bit stronger with the color, a little bit stronger with the contrast as I move around the rest of the painting. So that's my kind of idea there. So let's go. So the light hitting the front of these ones here, because it's in the focal point, I am going to make it a little bit more bold. So I'm going to ultramarine blue, a little bit of Indian yellow, and this is where the cobalt teal really comes into its own. I'm just going to splat some color in here just to keep it interesting. Now, I don't mind the top edge of the building here kind of just almost disappearing and dissolving into the background. We don't have to define every single edge. And then what I'm going to do here is use the negative shape of the tree behind to carve out the positive shape of the top of the building there. So we're using kind of negative shape there. And then here, just kind of a little bit of dry brush work, try and keep it fairly lively, soften those edges a little bit. Spray bottle, again, just to soften a couple of edges there. Don't want to, if you've put spray bottle down, try not to play with it, the marks that you've made too much. And then we're kind of into a bit more blue in there. Just block it in, dead simple, and just getting progressively darker. Prussian blue is always going to give you lovely rich dark. Sometimes they can be a bit too heavy. And then a tiny bit of red in there. So I'm really at quite creamy paint consistency here. And creamy, I mean like thick. rich paint consistency because I want that really deep, solid dark at the back there. Nice, simple brush strokes. Trying to leave plenty of little lights showing just to keep the area lively. And by lively, I mean, if you just have a big dark area, it can just feel a little bit too heavy and a bit overbearing. So I'm just trying to keep just these little specks of light in a few places, just to keep it interesting. And quite quickly, we're sort of, I find you kind of naturally start to move around the painting then. So that there's no right or wrong here, but that to me feels like it's naturally kind of led me into the building because we've got the shadow on the side of the building now. And here I'm going to go to more of like let's just try French ultramarine because it's going to have that lovely coolness to it. Let's give that a go and just see how it goes. So it's probably about kind of full fat milk paint consistency. And we're just going to just glaze it straight over the top here. Rather than like a solid straight line, I'm trying to, it's got this beautiful kind of look to the tiles in the side of the wall here of the old building. So rather than like a dead straight line, I'm just trying to make it a little bit more interesting, kind of broken edges and that sort of thing. And there's all of that lovely green color underneath. And I'm just going to let everything run together as much as possible. Notice I'm linking shapes together as much as possible. It doesn't really matter if the shadow from the building kind of meets the shadow of the trees. That can kind of soften and disappear as long as we get a nice kind of hard edge over here. So we're into kind of smaller shapes as we come up to the edge of the building there. And trapping the light. So I'm not going to get too caught up in all of the fencing here, but we can certainly kind of leave a little bit of it showing, that sort of thing. Notice I've dropped down to a much smaller brush and I'm kind of almost like sketching with the brush now. So just kind of moving around the painting, sketching with the brush. If you want those colours to flow together, because we've got so much water on the page, we can just let everything kind of flow together. We can even drop some greens in there. And just kind of playing with the paint for the most part. That shadow that comes under the tiles and the roof there, really nice. Again, just keep it dead simple. Bit more kind of broken, little bit of shadow coming under there. We'll get some colour on the doors and stuff like that. But you can see how quickly it all kind of comes to life. And it's just simple light and shadow. So that's the gentle shadow. So in the trees, I guess I'm doing the light family, softening the edge into the background, coming into the gentle shadow while it's still wet, and then putting in the deep shadow while that's still wet. And that's giving us a very kind of natural feeling to the foliage and really trusting the wet into wet nature of the medium. My only issue that I'm having is that the front edge of the building is a little bit wet, so the foliage behind keeps wanting to creep into it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I must keep an eye on it. But we've got this lovely soft edge on the top of the building, and then I've put in the gentle shadow of the building. So then we're back to the similar sort of process, and doing it while it's wet into wet, we're allowing the medium to do a lot of the work. So whilst it's still wet, I'm coming into the gentle shadow and I'm just introducing a deeper shadow. And by doing it now, we're going to let all of that lovely kind of color run together, and the medium is going to create like the variegation and the depth within the shadows. So when you have like one tone in the shadows, it looks good. As soon as you start putting like a little bit of that deeper dark in there, just kind of drop it in, let the medium do its thing, you just find that the shadows just take on a little bit more depth and become just that little bit more interesting once they start to go in there. So it's just a nice way to think about things if you can. And it's the benefit of kind of doing it like that. But all the time, let's let the medium do a lot of the work for us. Cool. That's all kind of making sense. You can see how easy it is to tinker, so we must move away. Nice shadow on there. And then we're sort of into a few smaller trees around the focal point. And then we'll obviously come back to the focal point to make it come to life and live. It needs detail and all that sort of good stuff. But at the moment, we'll just keep it simple. So there's a little bit of a bush just there catching the light. And then the back side of that bush is nicely in shadow. And by doing it whilst the front side is still wet, we're going to get a very kind of natural feeling to it. And then that bush is a bit of a splatter. Try and keep it a bit more loose and free, not so. That's better. A bit more of a nice feel to it. Running like colours together as much as possible. So whenever you have shapes of similar tone or the kind of shadow shapes, can we just link those shapes together as much as possible? A little bit of shadow cast off the back, just there. Okay, we're well on the way to all of this kind of working. As we come into here, now this is where it can be easy to get caught up in exactly what's happening. And what I'm trying to do is just find a way of representing this area that kind of makes sense in the painting. So I'm not trying to perfectly copy the subject, but I'm using it as a bit of a guide, which can be useful. Need to come back to that sort of rock type shape and make more sense of it in a moment. But you see, we're kind of spiraling around the focal point. It's kind of moving around, and eventually we'll naturally kind of move away from it, I feel, which is we're kind of beginning to move away from it as it is. And then kind of into the shadow on the side of this wall here, and the way that butts up against the front of the building is really nice. And before you know it, that building's kind of really standing out at us and working quite well. So again, we're kind of well underway. Don't want to get too busy in this area. We're starting to move away from the focal point. So I think we need to simplify now as we move away from the focal point. And I think I saw, I can't see the full chat, but every so often a question pops up. And I think I saw a question, someone asking if I always mix my greens. Even if I imagined it, it's still a great question. So I do always mix my greens, but it's not, I've got nothing against using tube greens, and I think they're really great. All I've found the few times that I have used tube greens is I kind of end up, tinkering with them anyway. I'm just adding more yellow and more blue. So I tend to just mix them as I go. And again, much like my greys, I tend to think of my greens as just being like cooler or warmer. Is it a more vibrant yellowy spring-like green? Is it a kind of more muted soft green? Is it a much cooler green that I could maybe even push it to be a little bit more blue? So and one thing I try to do as much as possible with greens, because I do think greens, this is a very green subject, and I think green can easily dominate a painting, which is fine because greens are lovely. There's almost an infinite choice of greens, which I think is part of the problem with them, why we all struggle with them a little bit, or many of us do. There's so many choices, but I try to just vary the green ever so slightly every time I come to the palette. And here I'm just trying to simplify this bit as much as possible. So, and that's kind of brought us down into this area. So I'm trying to find my way naturally around the painting. I like the way this big bush here is kind of casting shadow, and I'm going to purposely create like a more warmer shadow coming off the bush, and that's kind of leading us up into the focal point. And there's all sorts of stuff going on in this central area, but I wonder if we, for the most part, just keep it very simple and just have a little bit of a sketch with the brush. I'm kind of reserving that area because I don't want to overcook it all, so I'm just kind of leaving that, and may well leave it completely for the entire painting. So I think when it comes to levels of detail, it's important to we don't have to make all the decisions straight away. I don't necessarily know how much detail I want to put in this middle area, so rather than doing too much, we're going to get a bit of glare there, I'm afraid. Rather than doing too much, I'd rather do less, and then we might be able to come back and judge it more easily later, how much detail to do in that area. Okay.
There was a question that we missed from earlier.
Oh, yes.
Do you ever turn your paper around or paint upside down?
Yeah, I used to do that a little bit more, definitely, and it can really help, and especially when you're trying to focus on just painting shapes and really take yourself away from getting caught up in painting things. If I get too caught up in trying to paint a thing and get exactly what is the thing, it's easy to fall into that trap and away from just painting shapes. And we know that kind of painting shapes can be so much more beneficial to our painting. Having said that, whilst I used to do it a lot, I haven't done it in a long time, but it's such a great practice. It's a really great practice. And actually, you know what, I really should do that more.
Yeah.
It's such a good practice, definitely.
And another question, when we see this painting, especially where the glare from the light is on the water, there's like a texture that shows up. Is that your paper, or is that just a weird like camera?
No, it is. This is quite a textured paper. This is only the cold press. The oranges was a very rough paper. I don't know if you can see that on camera. I don't know if it shows, but you can see how rough it is.
A little bit.
Yeah, it kind of bleeds a lot because of how rough it is. That, and then even the cold press of this particular brand, the Bauhom, is a very, very rough paper, and with that, it stays wet a good amount of time as well. That's kind of one of the benefits of the paper. So I'm just trying to get being a bit more abstract in this foreground area, having a bit of a splash. Throw a bit more dark in there, and this area is kind of something and nothing. I'm just trying to, the buildings all make sense of it, because as I said at the start, we're just looking.
You could almost keep it as it is now with just the one building.
Yeah, it's not far off, is it?
Yeah, it already looks amazing.
I'll continue to ruin it by putting in the rest, but let's see how we go. But we can definitely we can paint these with a slightly more, as long as we're aware of light and shadow and everything that we're talking about, we can definitely paint these with a slightly more carefree kind of approach. So yes to accurate shapes, yes to right paint consistency to make sure we've got the right tone, but we can definitely approach them in a this slightly more sketchy kind of manner. We're getting a lot of glare on that side. Let me see if I can just, because I'm down in that area, I'll see if I can. It's
okay.
Yeah, it's better.
Oh yeah, that is better.
And then so I didn't actually mention lavender, but lavender is a fantastic color because it's got a lot of opacity to it. And I this area here, I'm not struggling with it, but I just don't quite know what to do with it, and I don't need to do a lot with it. Yet lavender, so I am going to play around a bit here. Lavender is a great color because it's very opaque, and it can cause problems in mixtures because of its opacity. However, because of its opacity, it's really great for kind of splatting into areas just to kind of liven them up if they've got a bit heavy. So I really like it for that. Cool. But what I'm going to do here is just kind of move around. So my shadow colors are a little bit cooler here. So we're kind of into our grays, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, touch of yellow to take the intensity of the purple out. Fairly big brush. I'm just kind of almost just kind of skipping around the painting and let it find its way. And we might even have some dappled light on that roof there. That could be quite nice. Whether it will end up looking like a roof, I don't know, because it needs a bit of tone behind it. Again, varying the greys ever so slightly every time I go to them. So I'm going to cool this grey down as I come over here, and then we're going to let it meet this shadow over here. So all the time, can I get kind of shadows to meet and flow together as much as possible? Always trying to find that balance between kind of accuracy, but keeping it nice and loose. The beautiful little door in there traps the light on there, and trying to think in terms of shape and light and shadow still, even at this stage. A little bit of that sort of thing, and just sort of trying to make some sort of sense of it, but not like answer every single question down there, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to give every single area like a total resolution. I'm just happy to leave some bits a little bit unresolved, and then with just the right amount of foliage behind, we can trap a little bit of light on that building. and it starts to come to life a little bit more. So really, that's very far into the painting. It's all making sense. It looks like the subject, kind of, and we're sort of well on the way. So now it's kind of maybe about 10 minutes just to really bring it to life. Let's really get it finished. I like the sort of smoky atmosphere down here, but it needs a touch more definition. We've got the gentle shadow. We don't have to put in deep shadow everywhere. It certainly doesn't have to be a super dark deep shadow, but at the same time, whilst there's a little bit of moisture on the page, and I'm going to keep that moisture there with the spray bottle, keep it wet, keep it kind of workable, we can definitely get a little bit more going on, maybe a little kind of wet into wet window in there, just to give it a kind of that depth in the shadows again. I was talking about, you get one tone in the shadows, great, that's going to feel really nice. There's always a place for that, but once you start getting that second tone in, as long as we don't overcook it with the detail, you just start to get a little bit more depth. That's going to have something just to subdue it a bit, because it's a bit kind of overly harsh at the moment, but these are all the little decisions to make. And I love this stage of a painting when it's all kind of working and I'm almost just kind of going around, I'm holding the brush a little bit lower down, just kind of skipping around the painting, popping in little bits here and there, and kind of seeing what we can make of everything. I'm going to drop down to an even smaller brush, because although it's not the focal point, I do want some of these shapes to feel a little bit nicer. Some of them are a little bit, almost like a little bit too sharp and rigid in places. Maybe a little bit of shadow just falling across the roof there and kind of sketching into the roof just to make it more interesting. That's better. All a bit neat. I don't like it when things get too neat, as you might have noticed. So I tend to drag a little bit more pigment for it. A bit too much light hitting the top of the roof there, and just tinkering with things, but not hopefully overworking them, trying to make it more. There's a reason for it. I'm not just painting away for no reason, but it's very easy to go too far with ideas. I just want a bit more information there. I actually really love the way that the yellow has bled into the colour of the roof. Initially I was like, oh no, I didn't want that. Didn't want that colour to go there, but it has, and actually I quite like it. And right, we're right on the kind of 5 final minutes here, and I think you can't avoid going back to the focal point. And I think if we can get the focal point working, then I'll be in a better position to judge, right, what's the last little hits of detail that we can put in this lower area to make it interesting enough, but not so much that it competes for attention with the main event, the focal point. So we can definitely, little chimney on the roof here. Love the chimney because it casts a shadow off itself. So that's a nice little detail for the focal point. So it's kind of detail to enhance rather than just for the sake of it. As we've said, nothing wrong with detail at all. It's a great thing. And it's almost, because detail's so lovely, it's almost, if you can be a little bit more selective with where you put it, it actually, makes more of it. If I can put a little bit of detail in here. And what you get is you get kind of areas with no detail playing off areas with detail, and they kind of exaggerate each other. Like areas of detail will make the abstract areas almost feel more abstract by comparison, and equally the more abstract loose areas are going to make the detailed areas feel more detailed than they actually are, just because of the contrast that we've created by different amounts of detail. It's just dead simple in there. It needs a little bit more texture. It's a little bit flat, but on the whole, I quite like it. This would definitely be a good one to just show you a few little flicks of opaque white right at the end without overdoing it. So easy to overdo it. I just want a bit more texture on there. So nice light tone. We're kind of going back into the light family, but adding just a bit more variegation. So just on the top of the roof there, I'm just going to add a touch more texture. really, really light, because you don't want to start putting in a big heavy tone here, but I just want to add more like of a patchwork texture to that area there, almost just laying the brush over it and seeing if we can just inject a little bit more life into it. And then the same down on the actual stonework of the building itself, so a little bit more texture. So if we just add just the right tone, it will add texture, but you won't, if we add too much dark, it will make the area feel like it's no longer the light family. But if we add just the right amount of tone, it'll add texture but not too much information. And then there's just a couple little more shadows to do there, little flicks of dry brush, and that works. Just under here, and I hate, everyone knows I hate using this word, oh, I'll just do this, I'll just do that, and inevitably like stop, and you can feel your own brain saying stop, but your hand won't. And I do like this area down here. I wonder if we can just pop in a little chimney and a couple of finishing details just to make it, that word again, just to make it work. Just enough interest. That's what I'm after. Just a little something here and there. We're kind of into dry brush territory. Just adding a touch more depth, but not overdoing it, hopefully. And then I do like the chimney on the roof here, if I can do it without overstating it. And it's almost like less the chimney itself, and obviously more the shadow that it's casting that is actually interesting. So something like that on the top, and the walls themselves could have a bit more texture, and they can get away with it here in the foreground area without going overboard. But really, I like the way it's kind of drifting in and out of focus, and for the most part I don't think it needs much more. So I think we'll just come back to the focal point, and with a view that you probably could do a little bit more to this, but actually, again, much like the oranges, I quite like it for its sort of simplicity and the fact it is quite abstract in a lot of areas and almost kind of unresolved in a few areas, but I feel in a good way. It's one of those where it could handle the overnight test. You know, we'll come back and look at it tomorrow and be like, oh, you know what? That word again. just pop in a little something here, pop in a little something there. And sometimes that's easier to see, you know, when you've not looked at the painting for a day or so, and then you come back to it and you can do more. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think it's doing everything that I wanted it to do. And hopefully it's a good example of how we've really gone for it on the focal point. The background is much softer. You can see how that spray bottle has really made a lovely misty, soft edges to the background. It gives the illusion that the background was painted a bit more wet into wet, but it was all the spray bottle.
It's more like a mist when you're spraying. It's a
mister, I guess. Yeah. So it's like it's such a light touch, and I'm doing it at a slight angle, and I'm kind of aiming to hit the edge of what I've just painted with like literally just one very quick mist. And what it does is it creates a little speckle of water, and then the wash you've just laid down just gently bleeds up into it, and you get this wonderful soft fuzziness. And the trick is to just do it and leave it alone. If you try and control it, that's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
What's nice is it also gives you just a little bit more moisture. You know, as I came in and blocked in this tree here, it just provided more moisture for me to work into, and then we get more soft edges. And all the time I'm just like, oh, where can we soften edges more? Like the more soft edges we can get, the simpler we can make our shapes. You know, where can we get big washes flowing together? How much information can we leave out rather than how much can we put in? It's just trying to flip it round all the time. If we look, there's a lot of information in, say this area down here, and even behind there, but I've just tried to distill it down into its most simplest form and ask, like, what's its purpose in the painting? So the purpose of this bit here in the painting is to really provide the negative shape for the focal point. So it's like everything else, beyond that is just you know, how far do you go beyond it just being a simple shape? And I like the fact there's a little bit of tonal variation, but super simple, no detail. This really was all just about some coolness and framing the painting. And this was very much just the shape that frames the painting. In fact, this entire shape here is just one big shape to sort of frame the painting and trap the focal point. So it's a good question to ask yourself when you're trying to simplify your subject. It's like, yes, it has all of that going on in the photo, but what in the painting, what kind of purpose does it actually serve? Like, what's it doing for the painting? And that can be a good question to ask yourself.
Just amazing.
But I think that's it, guys.
Do you have time for a few questions from the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Of course.
Okay, amazing. I can read them out, or you can check it yourself. What's easier?
If you could read them, Dena, that'd be great. Yeah, I can't really see them. Okay,
from Carol. How can you get a nice, thick, dry pigment with pan paints?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's quite hard. And it's definitely a lot harder with pan paints. I think it's all about that water balance. Like, so the spray bottle can be really useful to give just a little bit of dampness. And then I find that it's almost worth getting a slightly stiffer brush. So these soft brushes probably wouldn't quite do it with a pan thing. And you almost literally have to dig out the paint, if you know what I mean. Like, you have to be quite physical and hard with it and actually dig out the paint so that you start to get that lovely thick smushiness. Yeah. It's definitely a lot easier this is why I even, I've got loads of dry lumps of paint on my palette, and if I know particularly that I'm going to be using lovely rich deep darks, I will squeeze out fresh paint because it's so hard to really get dry paint nice and thick. You almost have to work the moisture into it, right, so that it becomes like a tube paint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, just enough water and enough work, and just keep working it until it gets thick. Definitely. Right. If it's that you want a specific dark and you're consistently struggling to get it, then it may be worth simply just getting a tube version of that one color, so that you can just squidge a tiny bit on top of your dry pan and know that you'll be able to get the density of pigment that you want. Say, like a Prussian blue or a French ultramarine, even if no other colors, that you can get a nice rich dark then at least.
Nice. Okay. Do you always use a hair dryer to be able to continue, or air dry and give your eyes a break?
It's funny, I probably should have more of a break, but I find once I'm into a painting, I'm kind of into it, and I'm also quite impatient. So a hair dryer is a good thing. The other thing is when I'm painting in the studio, I do tend to nurse the first stage a little bit more than when I'm demonstrating. So I might kind of sit with it as it's drying and be like, oh, now's a great time to add just a little bit more intensity of color there. So, and then when I'm 100% sure that I'm definitely not going to do any more and I'm feeling impatient, then I'll probably get the hair dryer on. But yeah, I might just nurse that first stage a little bit longer. Definitely.
Cool. Okay. What do you do when you forget to put the lights in until after?
Yeah, so it really depends what stage the painting at. So if you've got an area and it's still very wet and you're like, I forgot to leave the lights out there. If it's still wet, and this is why water gives you so much time, you can pull it out again. If it's nearly dry, if you're very careful, you can flood it with a little bit of water or get the mister on it and pull it out. That's one option. If it really has dried, or you can't get back to the really strong white of the page that you want, then as long as it's not like a huge area that needs to be lighter, in which case I would run it under a tap and literally lift it out and start again. But if it's like a little highlight or something, then that's when I fall on the opaque white. And I might as well give you an example. But if I'm using opaque white, I don't really use it on the palette. I tend to just take it straight out of the tube and use it thick as a highlight. And so, for example, I might, maybe I missed a highlight on the chimney and it might benefit from one really thick, straight out of the tube, and just simple. You don't want to work it into the painting too much, but you might just, use it to sharpen up the odd edge, add a little bit of detail here and there. And then what you'll find is the other two things that I do with opaque paint. One is that I might mix my white. You don't always want bright white. You might want a softer grey that has opacity to it, so you can stick it back in an area. So then I might mix a grey and just add a bit of white to it. And also lavender is a fantastic colour, because for me, lavender in many circumstances can be used to kind of pop in, if you've missed the light but you don't want a bright white. Lavender can quite often do that. So if you've got a really dark area and you want sort of a low light, you might call it, say back here, if I take some lavender, and you can kind of do that and use it like a highlight, but not as bright as white. So lavender's a great colour for that as well. So there's a few little things you can do there. I'm actually using white gouache, but titanium white watercolour will be fine as well. Gouache just has a little bit more opacity and body to it, and when you want a nice thick highlight at the end of a painting, that just helps a little bit, making it gouache.
Amazing. I'm checking the chat here. Okay, I stepped away for a bit, so I apologize if this was covered, but how do I avoid blooms? Happens when I paint, sorry, it happens when I paint wet on wet, and it seems like the paint is the same consistency.
Yeah, I mean, it really is just down to the amount of water, and if it is the same consistency and you're still getting them, then yeah, it's hard to know exactly, but sometimes it's like you sometimes get them because one stage of a painting is more dry than the other, which obviously happens all the time, but sometimes it can happen in a less than good way. Like you might have an area that's slightly dry, and then for some reason there's a lot more water here, and as that area is drying, the water from this area kind of creeps into the slightly dry area and causes blooms and things. So you do need to be a little bit aware of, like, if there's a big puddle of water somewhere, or there's a bit too much water in an area next to a nearly dry area. So that might be less to do with the mixture in your brush, if you're using what you feel to be a good paint consistency, and more to do with how the different stages of the painting or parts of the painting are drying next to each other, because that can be a problem sometimes.
Yeah,
it's like when I remember this bit here had a big puddle of water in it, but the sides either side were dry. That's why I was kind of getting my kitchen roll and sort of sucking the water out, because I knew if I didn't do that, the water from this area would seep in to the surrounding areas and get those blooms and those cauliflowers. And that was even with me making sure that I was using the right paint consistency, just the water had collected there.
Oh, they're so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. A few more questions. Let me know when you need to get going.
No, you're all good, Dena. Ask away.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's gouache, someone asked, right? The white opaque paint that you put on?
Yes, yeah, it is. I have used titanium white watercolor often, but I just happen to be using gouache at the moment. That's all.
Okay. From Ricky, what colors do you recommend if I need to limit my choices?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I always like using a fairly limited palette anyway. So, and then I tend to limit them to maybe one of each primary. So the big question to ask yourself is, like, what's the dominant color, or the color that I need the most, and start there. So if you wanted to have a really limited palette, but you're doing like a really vibrant green scene, there'd be absolutely no point in choosing like a cadmium yellow or a new gamboge and a French ultramarine, because those are never ever going to get you a bright green, however hard you try. However, if you didn't need a bright green, but you wanted more of a focus on like a vibrant purple, then having a French ultramarine or a cobalt blue is going to be really useful, because it's got that bias towards purple. But there'd be no point in choosing like a really heavy orangey red like cadmium red, because that's going to make your purples go very muddy. Whereas if you use like an alizarin crimson, a permanent rose, a quinacridone pink like I am, with French ultramarine, that's going to give you a very strong purple. So it's kind of, yeah, great, let's limit our palette, maybe one of each primary is one way of doing it, but be really aware of what your strongest colors that you need to reach are, and make that your start point with choice, and then the other color, just choose it kind of afterwards. And that's why I like, for example, cobalt teal, because I know with French ultramarine, a cool pink, an Indian yellow, I can get fairly vibrant oranges, but I'll never get like super bright oranges. I can get really lovely clean purples. I can get some interesting but very dull greens. But with the simple addition of cobalt teal blue, I suddenly expand my entire palette to include very bright greens, yet I only have 4 colors on the palette, and therefore my color mixing choices are significantly simpler. Color mixing becomes much easier, and the painting tends to naturally harmonize anyway from a color point of view, because you're only using a very limited amount of colors, and just that one addition of that color like blows the color wheel wide open. And cobalt teal blue is great because you mix it with even a red and you get really soft, beautiful grays. You mix it with that and you kind of lift the French ultramarine. So this is a very, very common limited palette for me. But yeah, hopefully that helps. So think about what the color that you want to be the strongest and that you're most reaching for, and then choose the first couple of colors based on that, and then kind of go from there.
Absolutely amazing. That was just so inspiring.
Amazing. Oh, it's such a cool idea, Dena. I love the breadth of like artists you get in. It's such a great idea.
Oh, it's been amazing. I'm just really honored that all these amazing artists are happy to give some time, you know, to share all their knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's just been.
I think there's so many artists. Like they're a good bunch, really. Like very friendly, very very giving really for the most part. It's really nice.
They really are. Yeah. So thank you again so much, Tom, and thank you to everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's been really fun.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. And yeah, great fun.